Good evening, I'm Farhana Sheikh. Here are our top stories for tonight. EU loans 90 billion euros to fund Ukraine, sidesteps Russian assets. And Putin says Ukraine not ready for peace talks. All that and more coming up on AWANI International. European Union leaders have agreed to loan 90 billion euros to Ukraine to fund its defense against Russia over the next 2 years, opting for joint EU loans instead of using frozen Russian assets. EU Summit Chair Antonio Costa says the funds would be provided urgently, describing the decision as necessary to keep Ukraine financially and militarily afloat.
EU officials warned that without this financial support, Ukraine could run out of money by the second quarter of next year, potentially tipping the war in Russia's favor. The bloc also gave the European Commission a mandate to continue exploring a so-called reparations loan based on frozen Russian assets. But that plan was deemed too complex for now, mainly due to legal and financial risks for Belgium, where most of the 210 billion euros in Russian assets are held. EU leaders said the Russian assets will remain frozen until Moscow pays war reparations, at which point Ukraine could use those funds to repay the loan. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urged the EU to eventually use Russian assets directly, calling it a morally justified step, even as leaders agreed the issue would be revisited later.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow does not believe Ukraine is ready for peace talks, despite claiming Russia is prepared to end the war through negotiations. Speaking at his annual press conference, Putin said any settlement must be based on principles laid out by Russia last year, including territorial demands, which Kiev has rejected. Putin also said Russian forces have seized the strategic initiative on the battlefield, claiming troops are advancing across the front line and that Ukrainian forces are retreating. Now, as the EU fails to reach consensus on using Russia's frozen assets to back a major loan for Ukraine and opting instead for a 90 billion EU loan, Julia Rutherford of Taylor's University says the outcome was predictable, citing both political and economic risks as well as competing pressures from Washington.
But it's not surprising that there is a rift between the European countries and European political elites on what to do with these frozen assets. I think what's going on is partly, the need of funds in order to aid Ukraine, to render aid to Ukraine. On the other hand, it's also sort of a reaction to the 28-point plan proposed or coming from the US administration, from the White House. So it looks like the EU would like to jump in and maybe preempt the distribution of these funds, because the plan proposes, if I'm not mistaken, to put the funds into reconstruction of Ukraine. So the EU would like to have a say in it, and that's why they had a meeting about it. But it was, in my mind, predictable that they want to agree on expropriating these frozen assets completely, because it's related to political and economic risks, including the Belgium itself, which hosts the majority of those frozen assets, up to 180 billion. But the loan is supposed to be still coming from Euroclear. So how it will be channeled, distributed, and then later on compensated for, that's quite unclear. So if, let's say, the war is over, will Russia be asked to compensate for this loan? So that would amount then to the same expropriation of Russian assets in favor of Ukraine.
Amid divisions within the EU, Julia argues that the real debate is whether Europe is choosing escalation over de-escalation of war, questioning the motive behind such a provocative move.
So what the division among the EU states is, it seems, it's not even over the issue of who is a friend of Russia and who is not, but over the issue of perpetuation of the war which Russia is, well, maybe it's not exactly succeeding, but it's not exactly losing it. And it has the capacity, what's most important, to continue it. So it's provoking it to keep continuing it with to double down on its effort, and some of the European leaders wouldn't like to see that. The justification of that, if Russia is not stopped, it will move further to Europe. I think it's groundless, because the decision in the first place was made on based on particular security concerns. So we have to ask the question if it's a warmongers in Europe that would like to go for this highly provocative move and make Russia to double down on its effort.
That's the headline for tonight. More coming up shortly after the break.
Desember ini, Astro dengan bangganya membahawakan Sukan Si Thailand 2025, di mana wira kita bangkit menuju kegemilangan. 12 hari liputan langsung menyeluruh, 54 acara sukan. Sokong atlet kita, dengarkan laungan mereka di Sukan Si Thailand 2025 Ever Forward, secara langsung di Astro Arena dan Astro Go.
Buli di sekolah. Isu ini bukan perkara baru. Buli tertakluk kepada perbuatan agresif secara fizikal.
Apa sebenarnya Jerebu punca utama yang menyumbang kepada masalah ini serta kesannya kepada kesihatan kita?
Mereka akan mengalami iritasi-iritasi kepada mata. Selain itu, iritasi kepada saluran pernafasan.
Welcome back. TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance has signed binding agreements to create a new joint venture that will hand control of the app's US operations to American and global investors. Under the deal, a new entity will take over operations of the app in the US.
American and global investors, including Oracle, Silver Lake, and Abu Dhabi-based MGX, will hold 80.1% of the company, while ByteDance retains 19.9%. The law requiring a sale or ban of the app was passed in 2024, with President Donald Trump delaying its enforcement to allow the deal to proceed. TikTok CEO Shou Ziqiu said the new joint venture will operate as an independent entity, with authority over data protection, content moderation, and algorithm security in the US. However, questions remain about ByteDance's ongoing role, including whether the app's core algorithm has been fully transferred or remains under Chinese control. The deal, expected to close on January 22nd, would secure TikTok's future for more than 170 million American users, while shifting its US operations under majority non-Chinese ownership for the first time.
Australia will launch a national gun buyback scheme following the deadly mass shooting at Sydney's Bondi Beach. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says the nationwide buyback will target surplus, newly banned and illegal firearms, stressing that more must be done to keep guns off the streets.
There are now more than 4 million firearms in Australia, more than at the time of the Port Arthur massacre, nearly 30 years ago. The government will introduce legislation to support the funding of this buyback scheme and meet the costs on a 50-50 basis with states and territories. We expect hundreds of thousands of firearms will be collected and destroyed through this scheme.
The scheme would be the largest since 1996, when Australia tightened gun laws after the Port Arthur massacre that killed 35 people. Following that attack, the national buyback led to the surrender of around 640,000 prohibited firearms at a compensation cost of about 304 million Australian dollars. Australia will also observe a day of reflection on December 21st, 1 week after the attack, to honour the victims. 15 people were killed and dozens wounded when 2 gunmen opened fire at Bondi Beach last Sunday during Hanukkah celebrations.
The US military says it carried out strikes against 2 alleged drug trafficking boats in the Eastern Pacific on Thursday, killing 5 people. The attack marks the third such strike this week, bringing the total death toll from US strikes to at least 104 people. US strikes killed 8 people on 3 boats on Monday, followed by another strike that killed 4 others on a single vessel on Wednesday. Thursday's attack came hours after the U.S. House of Representatives rejected resolutions that would have required the Trump administration to seek congressional approval before continuing strikes against alleged drug boats. President Donald Trump said he has no problem informing Congress about a possible attack on Venezuela as U.S. military operations intensify following a major U.S. military deployment to Latin America. Meanwhile, at Venezuela's request, the United Nations Security Council will hold an emergency meeting on Tuesday to discuss the situation. In global politics, 2025 may be remembered as the year an old order ended. In part 1 of our Wu Says Year-End Special, Professor Emeritus Dato Wu Wing Tai and Melissa Idris look back at the defining events of 2025. Here's a segment from the conversation about looking ahead to 2026 and what can be expected from the US.
For now, I want to ask you, as we wrap this year, having said all of this, that there are serious problems that the world is facing, that it could get worse before it gets better. Are you optimistic or pessimistic heading into 2026? Where do you see the global order the new global order falling into place? Can you look into your crystal ball for us today and tell us what you see happening next year?
Well, I think in the global order, I think that what we will see is that we will see peace in Europe, albeit at the loss of Ukrainian territory. The emergence of a let's say, cloth curtain in Europe. You will have countries that are definitely buffer states, like Hungary, Ukraine, and the states between them, between these two countries. There will be peace in Europe, which is good. Now, we will see China being much more assertive within the first island chain. And I see it as also the beginning of its testing of moving into the second island chain, largely because the Americans will be really worried if you go beyond the second island chain, because then you can fire a nuclear device from a submarine, which will reach the United States very quickly.
Yeah, proximity.
Yeah. So I think the breaching of the first island chain, we will see a testing of that. And what we will see is the Americans putting more restrictions on its trading partners on things like, not only can you not reship goods from China, the products you made, even though it's using local material, it better not be owned by a Chinese firm.
Yeah, wow.
So this forces Malaysia into a very tricky situation. That means one of our traditional sources of growth is FDI and transfer of foreign technology through FDI. So if the Americans are putting restrictions like that, how are we going to push being neutral? Because being neutral is not a self-declared achievement. It has to be something that's accepted by both sides.
Catch the full conversation on AWANI International and across our social media platforms. That concludes AWANI International for tonight. Stay with us as we track the strategies and power shifts shaping the new global order. For more updates, visit international.astroawani.com and follow us on social media. I'm Farhana Sheikh. Thank you for watching and good night.